This is the Bearcast, presented by Bird Culture Ford. Bird Culture Ford has been in Waco since 1936. Ford is the #1 selling truck in Texas 43 years running. The Bearcast is also presented by WellMed Medical Management and USMD Health System Dallas. Here's Craig Smoak and Grayson Grundhoefer.
And good afternoon on this Tuesday, May the 2nd. It is noon here in Waco, and we welcome you into another edition of the Bearcast on SicEm365.com and also 365 Sports, the YouTube channel. Please hit like and subscribe if you're joining us and you haven't done that previously. We do appreciate your support, and that's one way of showing it. But I'm Craig Smoak. As always, joined by Grayson Grundhoefer, got Jack McKenzie and Garrett Ross behind the scenes as well, making things happen and making us look good, which is not an easy task. And we are here this week to talk, well, as always, all things Baylor athletics, but with a focus primarily on the NFL draft. Now that that's come and gone, one player directly affected and a few others getting opportunities coming out of the NFL draft festivities over Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. I've also got a little, note on the XFL and a little Baylor flavor there with one player who will be playing for a championship, and then spring sports kind of ebbing and flowing as they start to wind down into the final stretch here as May gets underway. But hope you're having a good week so far. We do appreciate you listening whenever you do, however you do. And Grayson, how are we doing this week?
I'm doing good. And I was actually at the draft.
That's right. Yeah.
On Thursday. I didn't get to see any Baylor names called, but it was a fun experience. So kind of coming back from that and just seeing how the draft unfolded, seeing Apu get drafted was obviously really cool on TV. And, it wasn't the greatest draft class, which, Baylor hasn't had great draft classes really for a while outside of last year. They're 2021. That season, they had a great draft class. But outside of that, it's kind of been very hit or miss, it feels like, for these Baylor prospects, which I know we're going to talk about here in a little bit. But outside of that, the Baylor roster is kind of taking shape now. We kind of know what they're going to look like going forward into the fall. And outside of that, it's just been a busy week with recruiting, honestly. Baylor continuing to look around there, try to find some prospects, and obviously the coaches are on the road right now. So a lot of movement there.
So what brought you to the NFL draft for one night?
Just a trip with friends. They wanted to go. Each of our 4 teams had a pick in the first round. I'm a Colts fan, for those who don't know. So Anthony Richardson, obviously that was a very cool experience there. And we just wanted to go. And it was crazy. 160,000 people went to the draft in Kansas City. It got up to like 320,000, which is second most all time behind the one in Nashville that had, I think it was over 600,000, which I was there. I can't even imagine what that looked like. But it was a very unique experience and something I definitely won't forget. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah, it's cool. I haven't been able to experience from the just running around in the fans and drinking beer and doing that whole thing. It was more work related, which that can be fun, but you want to be able to experience the other side too and just enjoy it sometimes. So I think we probably had slightly different experiences, but no, it's a cool deal to go to regardless. And are you feeling okay about Anthony Richardson at 4 overall?
Yeah, actually, I got to the draft, and honestly, when you're there, you talk to so many people who have different opinions and so many Colts fans. And honestly, the resounding theme, including me, was just not Will Levis. Just please not Will Levis. That's all we were saying. And so CJ Stroud gets taken at 2, which was the guy who I kind of wanted. But to be honest, he was more the guy I wanted because of his floor. Richardson, though, just how exciting it is to see someone that talented, go to the Colts is really cool. I get to pair him with Jonathan Taylor in the run game. And so, yeah, I'm excited for it. They had a great draft. Everyone continues to talk about them, which kind of makes me a little concerned, though, because a lot of times that doesn't turn out too well. But I personally am intrigued by it. They got a lot of guys that I really wanted them to get in the draft, including Anthony Richardson. So pretty cool.
Yeah, we'll see. There's a lot of split takes on his future and how that works out. So, that'll be seen over time. But it's much like a recruiting class. When you sign it, they're all great, and you love them all, and they're all going to be the next big thing. And then, it depends on how much you talk about them after that, depending on what they do. But I saw a stat, I forget what team it was, just the other day. It was like the end of last week I think it might have been Oregon. Their class from like a year or two ago is already over halfway gone.
Oh my gosh.
And it was like, but it was like a top 10 celebrated class, but it was less than 2 years later and half the guys are gone. Or like A&M's class from a year ago is the all-time greatest class. Half of them are gone already. So it's just, that's how the draft is, though. You celebrate it and you have no idea whether it's going to be any good or not. But at the time, it's awesome. So, cool you got to experience that. And for those that have been out to the draft, it's a pretty cool deal as it continues to make its way around the country. Eventually, maybe more of you will get to go if you get the opportunity. I suggest doing so. But for Baylor fans watching the draft, in general, didn't have a certain team of the 32 to really pull for. There wasn't much to keep track of or to watch or anything along those lines. A very quiet draft in comparison to last year. Last year was record-breaking. We've had a lot of that here lately of, it's not quite as good because it's also being compared to what, like, the best version of it ever was. So whether it was, like, the last couple teams or, I guess, last year's team compared to the year prior or this year's draft compared to the year prior or accolades compared to the year prior, like, everything's taken a step down versus the greatest year they ever had in every way imaginable. So that's been I think a tough adjustment for some people after riding the high of last year. And that was certainly the case with this draft. 6 guys picked last year and just one this year. Siaki Ika ends up going in round number 3, the 98th overall pick to the Cleveland Browns, and always was viewed after the initial wave. Like, for example, I saw a mock draft last night and just going back over some notes. Connor Galvin was listed as a first-round draft pick, and they've already got mock drafts out for next year. And I think that's what made me look back at it was just like how foolish those are and how off. I mean, other than like, okay, yeah, Caleb Williams is going to be the number 1 overall pick, but beyond that, like, who really the heck knows? So
there's so much that goes into it that people, you can't guess it, specifically for like a guy like Connor Galvin, especially a guy who covered his recruitment. Like, he's not the most athletic guy. So you throw him in a combine, doesn't go great. You have to add in the interview process, when people see your frame, all of that just comes into play, and it's really hard to just predict that,
Yeah, I mean, beyond the Georgia, Alabama, Ohio State guys or Bijan or whoever that are kind of picks. But, yeah, I mean, Connor Galvin was listed as a first-round pick in a mock draft last year. He ends up going undrafted. My point being, Siaki Ika was listed as a first-rounder in a few mock drafts that I saw around this time last year. Then that kind of moved after the season to more of a second-round type of pick, and then lo and behold, finally get the draft time. And it was a pretty quiet draft process for him, like no all-star games. He worked out at the Combine and Pro Day, but it was just kind of quiet. And sure enough, he goes at the end of round number 3, and it got dangerously close to the point where you could have turned off the TV at the end of Friday night, the end of round 3, and he was still sitting out there. But luckily, a couple picks before they end the festivities on day number 2, he does in fact go, and he goes to the Cleveland Browns. And my initial reaction was just like, oh, thank God, like I can finally stop paying such close attention to this and just kind of enjoy it from here on out. But also, why Cleveland? Why is it always Cleveland for Baylor players? I mean, you love the opportunity, but it's always Cleveland, it seems like. I would think they'd be sick of it at this point. But, I know certainly Baylor fans are kind of sick of, like, Cleveland again. Josh Gordon and Spencer Drango and Phil Taylor and Andrew Billings is a Brown. And it just seems like Corey Coleman was a Brown for a little while. It's like you can't get away from them. But maybe this is the pick that changes all those things. Siaki Ika, 3rd round, 98th overall. He's a Cleveland Brown. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, again, another Brown situation. But for Apu specifically, he had to go to a place that really valued potentially playing a 3-4, but also just valued his size, right, as a potential nose tackle. He's going to have to play some defensive tackle at the pro level, but in general, you're going to want to utilize him in the interior of the defensive line. And so, I wish he had gone earlier, obviously. I wish he had gone to another place. But, there are some at least exciting things about the Browns right now. You know, Deshaun Watson may be better in his second year back. But yeah, I mean, in general, I'm fine with it. You're either going to make it or you're not, honestly, in the NFL. And I think Apu's one of those guys that can absolutely make it. He's shown a lot of flashes during his time at Baylor. And if he's put in the right situation, at least on the field, then I think he can do absolutely great in the NFL, you know, or at least very good and fill a role in the NFL at least.
Yeah, I mean, he should be able to. I think that if he gets all his ducks in a row and has the right focus and doesn't get, you know, fat and happy off of just, you know, making it like a lot of guys can, it's like they get there and they forget, like, oh, no, now you got to stick around.
Right.
I think so long as he maintains that focus and that drive and that hunger, he's a newborn. He's the father to a newborn. I know it's a big part of his life now, and this is a big dream of his come true. So, yeah, I'm happy for him. It's just like, it's always the Browns, though. It's what it seems like. It's always some Cleveland connection, but hopefully this one, like I said, works out well, and there are some aspects of that franchise that are, you know, at least moving in what looks like a positive direction or an exciting direction. So we'll see if he can't be a part of that in some way. I listened to their GM and their head coach, the press conference afterward, and they said that he's a guy that they basically told that you're not a dump truck anymore, you're a Ferrari.
Yeah. Whatever that means.
I think it means that at Baylor he was used as basically like the big bully nose tackle and the big, you know, run stopper, and I think they feel like he can be a bit more versatile than that at the next level. It's kind of how I took it, or they want him to be that way at the next level. That's how I took it. Maybe it's more of like his motor running or something like that. I don't know, but that's what they said was, you know, less of a dump truck, more of a Ferrari. So that can mean anything. And, you know, said that he's a versatile player more so than he showed in college because, again, they were designing him to have to play a certain way, and Cleveland feels like he can do maybe a bit more than he showed. And there were some things like that. Really, his personality won him over. So they seem pleased to have gotten him, and I'm excited for him. But, yeah, third round, 98 overall, and that was the draft summary for the Baylor Bears. That was it. No Connor Galvin, no Mark Milton, no Ben Sims. We'll get to all those guys because there was eventually news on them, but that was it. So 6th the year prior was the record, 1 this year. And does that mean anything to you one way or the other? I know it was disappointing for people because you'd love to have more guys to follow or track or anything, but this was kind of the expectation we were sort of building up for as well. So any thoughts just in general on having the 1 pick? Does that mean anything? Does it look a certain way? How do you feel about that?
I mean, it definitely shows a reason why they went 6 and 7 last year.
That shows some of it, yep.
It absolutely does. I mean, when you have talent, guys get drafted. We saw TCU lead the conference in draft picks. Well, I'm sorry, they didn't lead the conference, but they led the new Big 12 in draft picks. I think they might – did they have more than Texas and Oklahoma?
What?
TCU? They have more draft picks than those two? Yeah, they did.
Yeah,
right?
easily. Yeah, they had 8 to like 5 apiece.
Yeah, so, I mean, there's a reason they won the conference, right? And so I think that stood out to me for sure. And we saw their names continue to get taken off the board. And so I just think it signifies, hey, this was a 6-win team last year. And if they're going to be better than that this year, they need more guys to be drafted because – if they do have more guys drafted, it just simply means they're a lot better. But in general, you know, that stood out. I think the fact that the Big 12 was 4th in draft picks stood out. It's something that needs to be corrected and fixed. And, I mean, that's the Big 12, including Oklahoma and Texas as well. So you get rid of those teams, you know, maybe add in the other schools, see where we would be at.
I mean, at least as this year goes, they had the most first-rounders they've had since Nebraska and A&M and Colorado and Missouri were in the conference. So that was actually – they had 6 first-rounders. They had a combined – you want to guess how many in the last 2 years they've had?
1.
0.
0
first-rounders the last 2 years. They had 6. This time around, and only Bijan and then I think Oklahoma with the offensive lineman Harrison had 2 of the 6.
Yeah.
But then if you take them out, they had 5 apiece. The other 4, 3 of the 4, UCF had nobody. That's got to change. But everybody else combined for 10. So there was no difference. There was no difference. You had 2 extra teams, even though 1 did nothing. But those 3 combined for the same.
To get them to 30 again. So
and the ACC, quite frankly, the Big 12 was more of like 3rd And then by the end of it, like the 7th round was over with. The ACC had passed them. I don't know at what point they passed them, but the Big 12 was sitting there looking pretty good early on. And then, like, this was actually one of the better drafts they've had in a while.
Right, but I guess where I'm going at is, yeah, it'd be fine that you're right around the ACC, but you're not even close to the Big 10 or the SEC.
Well, that's never going to happen.
Right, but it's going to separate even more.
Yeah, that's where it's all going.
Right,
yeah.
And so that's a bit of an issue. I mean, it's a bit of a red flag. Yeah, 30, that's good, but the SEC, when they had Texas and Oklahoma, would have been over 70. The Big 10 adding USC and UCLA probably would have pushed them high 60s if you had those schools, or somewhere in the 60s. So, yeah, that was something that also stood out to me. Obviously, it's good that they're right there with the ACC. That's where they really need to be at this point. But it just did stand out how that disparity seems to continue to widen and widen and widen. And with expansion, it's going to get even more, different. And so for Baylor, I think Baylor needs to continue to groom and develop draft picks, but the Big 12 in general needs to do that as well. Continue to develop and get guys into the NFL, because at the end of the day, that does signify talent. And that does tell you a lot of things that do happen on the field on Saturdays.
It does, but I hate to break it to people. That's only going to get worse. Now it's the way it's going. I mean, the Big Ten's now going to have 2 more teams, and a good portion of what the Pac-12's been able to rely on is coming from one of those teams. The SEC, who's already like King S when it comes to draft picks the last several years, they actually got a little bit of competition from the Big Ten, but they're about that. Oklahoma and Texas, that's another 10 picks from this last year's draft. Now, granted, those teams haven't been putting up 10 picks every year combined, but close to it, if not passing it. So, I mean, it also helps when you're comparing 16 teams to 12 and you're comparing 14 to 10. I mean, not that those extra 4 are all putting out 5 apiece. You're never going to really close that gap just because Alabama and Georgia, and then you add in Tennessee having a big year, and LSU, and I mean, it's just a bunch of schools with a bunch of NFL guys. You're just never going to close that gap at this point. It's impossible unless like 5 teams all at once miraculously have the greatest classes they've ever had, and that's just hard to imagine how that would happen. So, yeah, you're never going to catch them, but if you can close the gap a little bit, that'd be great. I just don't know how you go about doing that, and that's one thing this staff has yet to kind of show, because part of it's just time and what they inherited and all that, but we're starting to now get into that point where we're going to see more of how they develop players and how that goes. But yeah, that gap I feel is only gonna widen, unfortunately.
Yeah, and I mean, if you just want to kind of narrow it down even more simplistically, Alabama, Georgia, Florida, Tennessee. If you just took those 4 teams, they would have more draft picks than the entire Big 12.
Yeah.
So.
And everybody else, for that matter. I mean, most everybody else. The Pac-12,
they'd be 1 below the ACC, and then, but as we mentioned,
with 4 teams,
right? With 4 teams, and then. The Big Ten obviously is way above that number. But, yeah, I mean, it's pretty insane. They'd have more than the Pac-12, more than the Big 12, and right behind the ACC with just those 4 teams this year.
Well, that is what it is, and that's not changing. That's only going to probably grow. But as far as Baylor goes, and the Big 12 was a big first round with 6 players selected, 4th amongst the conferences overall. But the best mark, like I said, since 2011, when the conference last underwent its major shift in teams moving on and then welcoming new ones in, and they're about to undergo that once again. So for those that it matters to, the Big 12 would have had the same number with the new version. Well, not this version with Texas, Oklahoma, and the new 4, but like the newer version with just the 4 coming in would have been the same as what they got this year. But every year that'll differ, obviously. Every year that'll be up and down depending on all 6 of those schools and how their classes are coming along. But overall, I thought it was actually a pretty good year. But, yeah, if you look at it from like who's still in front of you, that's just never going to make you happy. But for Baylor, the 1 pick in Siaki Ika, and then there were a bunch of undrafted free agents that came along down the pipeline as well. Connor Galvin, offensive lineman, signs with the Detroit Lions. Mark Milton, cornerback, signs with the Carolina Panthers. Ben Sims, tight end, signs with the Minnesota Vikings. Also had Christian Morgan, safety, signing with the Packers, and those were all just regular undrafted free agent deals, so they'll get a little bit of money depending on whatever they agreed to initially. It just depends on the player and the team, but they'll get some type of money and also have a little bit of a more secure spot, but nothing super secure. Like, they're not bound for the NFL next year or anything like that at this point, but they're on the team. Like, they have a place as of now, prior to cuts later this summer and all of that. They have a place on the team. Meanwhile, some other players, Gavin Holmes agrees to a minicamp deal with the Eagles. Wide receiver, offensive lineman Jacob Gall has actually a couple of opportunities for minicamps from both the Colts and the Falcons, and I have yet to hear on how he's going to work that. I don't know if those are on the same weekend. Obviously, if they are, then he can't do both. But if they're on different weekends, he could, in theory, do both. But I have yet to hear on how that's going to work or what those dates are. Khalil Keith, offensive lineman, signs with the Giants. And then I actually saw where Isaac Power apparently is getting an opportunity with the Broncos as a minicamp guy. And so basically there will be a minicamp across the league for all 32 teams that either happens this weekend or it happens the next weekend. That depends on whichever team you're talking about. They all have to do it, though, in one of these next 2 weekends. And basically it's a tryout. That's what it is. Minicamp tryout. You're guaranteed nothing, but you get an opportunity on the, I guess the weekend to, or however they do it, to go and work out and try and make the team and impress somebody and maybe get a practice squad spot or something like that eventually. But it's better than nothing. And so cool for guys like Gavin Holmes and Jacob Gall and Khalil Keith and I believe now Isaac Power as well to have that opportunity. But anything stick out to you from the list of guys who are all getting an undrafted job or getting a minicamp opportunity?
For sure. Let's start with Jacob Gall. So Indianapolis has their rookie minicamp May 7th through 9th, and then Atlanta May 14th through 16th. So, yeah, it looks like he'll be able to do both of those. So that's great for him. 2 opportunities, which I don't know that we see that very often. So good for him. I'm very curious about Khalil Keith going there with the Giants to see if he can really show some flashes and if he can stand out there for them. As far as the undrafted free agents, Ben Sims going to the Vikings, I think that's a great landing spot. He'll be there with James Lynch. So that'll be fun. I think, he'll be behind TJ Hawkinson there, but I do think it's a kind of a perfect landing spot, honestly, for the Vikings. Mark Milton going to the Panthers. I kind of thought that Baylor's connection with Carolina would be gone after Matt Rule left, but I guess it continues there with Milton. Great speed, as we've seen, but needs to improve, I think, if he wants to make the Panthers squad this year. Connor Galvin, good for him. Lions, that's a pretty good situation. Their offensive line is really good. They have a good offensive line coach, so I think he'll be able to learn quite a bit. And then Morgan, good for him. We've gotten to see him a lot at Baylor. Was at Baylor, it felt like forever. So to see him get an opportunity, I think will be really cool. And we'll just see if these guys can take advantage of it. Nothing's guaranteed at all with these guys as far as making teams, though.
No, I mean, other than Ika, and if he were to not make the team, that would be a disaster. So, I feel like he has the opportunity to have a pretty good pro career. And just hope he can go and handle his business and go and represent well. But, yeah, for these other guys, a pretty good haul. I mean, that's, 7-8 names that are all getting at least a chance. And, yeah, I mean, the odds of even half those guys lasting beyond a mini camp or a training camp are not great, but that's the case around the entire league for everybody who put guys out in the pros this past weekend one way or another through the draft or after the draft. And so we'll see. Maybe Connor Galvin sticks around Detroit for a while, and maybe Christian Morgan carves out a spot in Green Bay. I mean, I could certainly see Ben Sims lasting with Minnesota for a little while. So we will see. But a little bit of a disappointment just going back like a year ago. You definitely would have expected more than one guy. Ika would have been your first choice. Beyond that, you would have probably thought Connor Galvin could have gotten drafted or Ben Sims could have gotten drafted. But, like you said, wasn't a great year, and there were a lot of different things that went into that. But it did have an effect ultimately on where, the draft fell as well for Baylor players this season. So that's where we stand. Best of luck and congrats to all those guys for moving on to the next level. Did want to make note, meanwhile, a player who wasn't drafted last year, he signed a really nice undrafted contract and then didn't make the team. Abram Smith with the New Orleans Saints, he'll be playing for an XFL championship after the DC Defenders won their game this past weekend. He leads the league in rushing, and they will be going to the championship game here right around the corner and trying to win a title. So good luck to Abram Smith in that regard, and maybe that gets him another look at the NFL as well, although at running back, that's a tough task because there's just so many guys, and it's just such a quick, career for a lot of running backs these days. Just as far as your youth, just it's gone in a flash, and it's on to the next guy who has less tread on the tires. So who knows how that goes, but he's certainly done everything he can possibly do, and he's having some success in the XFL, so he can go win a title, and that'd be awesome for Abram Smith.
Yeah, it would be really cool. I think, the only thing that concerns me about his chances in the NFL was how quickly it felt like he was cut by the Saints, and then we just didn't hear a word about him potentially getting signed by anyone.
He signed a good deal too. Like it wasn't like it was like a couple $100,000 or something.
They spent money on like you're exactly right. They spent money on him to get him to camp, and then it did not work out. He didn't play well in the preseason, and he was let go pretty quickly. So yeah, I mean, this maybe puts something on film that they didn't see before. Maybe, again, just gives him a shot at making a roster in the NFL. We'll see. I'm holding out hope because he was so good at Baylor. But clearly there were things that he needed to work on to become more of a complete back. And that's why he didn't make the team, for the Saints.
Yeah, I mean, there was a competition. There was other guys that were fighting for the same thing, and he just was the odd man out when all was said and done. So that's part of it. That's part of the business, and that's the cruel part that ends up happening. So we'll see, but he's playing for at least an XFL championship this weekend, and that's kind of a rundown of the draft. But that leads us into, I guess it was Travis or whatever, put out a thing about next year's draft already, which I haven't even begun to try and think about that all that much, but threw out a list of potential names: Garmin Randolph, Matt Jones, Dominic Richardson, Clark Barrington, and there are others, but you wanted to touch on this. So your thoughts on, I guess, next year and the possibilities there for the draft?
I actually got asked about this in my chat, and then Travis just posted a separate thread on it just to, I guess, create more conversation, which worked out pretty good because a lot of people kind of chimed in. And the way that I separated it was kind of, I have 4 guys who I feel like will get drafted, which 4 would be obviously a very high number for Baylor. And then I have some maybes. But to me, the 4 that I'm looking at who I really think will get drafted are Clark Barrington, TJ Franklin, Gabe Hall, and then Byron Vaughns, the transfer from Utah State. They all kind of fit in to positions that are of need in the NFL as far as pass rushers, defensive linemen, of course, Clark Barrington being a versatile offensive lineman. If he shows he can play center at a high level, that'd be huge for him, I think, as far as making the NFL. And then you have some guys who could leave early. Maybe a Keytron Jackson has a massive year. That would take, major projections on my part, but could happen, I guess. Dom Richardson, again, he could play another year at Baylor, but if he has a big year, that's another one to keep an eye on. And then guys that I feel like are probably more undrafted free agent guys, like a Matt Jones, maybe Garmin Randolph, but again, feels more like an undrafted free agent right now at this time based on what we've seen. Elijah Ellis, does his 1 year of production, would that be enough to get him drafted? I'm not so sure. And then Drake Dabney, also kind of, how much better is he than Ben Sims? Would he get drafted? Maybe. He's bigger, he's longer, but still has some of those same problems that Ben had up front as well. So that's kind of how I looked at it. I see 4 guys on this team getting drafted, but again, that changes throughout the season, I feel like, as guys have big years or if they don't play very well.
Yeah, as I mentioned with Connor Galvin, this time a year ago, he's like a first-round mock draft guy, and now he's an undrafted pickup. Siaki Ika was a first-round guy. He was a late third-round guy. So, and like that's just 2 Baylor examples. I could probably use plenty of examples around the rest of the country as well of the early mock draft versus the actuality at the end of the road. But, that's something to go off of and something to at least keep in mind moving and looking at next year's roster.
Yeah, and I think people get caught up on those mock drafts because I got a question, did Connor Galvin coming back hurt his draft stock? And to me, it didn't. to me, it just was the reality of, who he was as a player and how he was viewed by the actual NFL, not people who just literally went through the Big 12 and was like, oh, Connor Galvin, offensive line MVP from the Big 12. He's got to be good. Let's just throw him in to a first round of the mock draft. You know what I mean? Like, that's what happens often. And so, those things are usually more wrong than they are right.
But they do need to show that they can produce talent. I mean, that's one thing that will be used in recruiting, and that's one thing you hang like the banner in the indoor because of all the NFL draft picks you have, and that's something that's always going to be, a pull for certain guys. I mean, everybody in recruiting now has their own thing. Maybe the first thing they ask about is NIL. Maybe the first thing they ask about is degree possibilities. The first thing they ask about is what are the living situations like or whatever. But I think in particular when you're not in the biggest conference or the biggest two, and you're not going to be, and that gap is only going to grow wider, and when you're not a big, huge NIL money shaker, you're going to have to, I know faith over football and family over football and person over player, that's their pull, but there's going to have to be some success pull elsewhere. And I think, showing that you can develop guys and put them into the league on a regular basis is going to be important for this program and this staff to be able to show that they can do that on a semi-regular basis. I don't think anybody's expecting, 5 guys a year to go, because that's just not really kind of how they're built at the moment. But you don't want to go 2-3 years and have a couple guys drafted over that time period, you know?
And you always compare yourself to other schools in the Big 12, and the thing of it is Texas Tech had a guy go top 7, and that matters. With Tyree Wilson, I know Bijan.
Thanks,
Texas,
Matt Wells.
Yeah, right, because he transferred with Matt Wells, and I know Joey McGuire's probably. They're going to take credit for that, as they should. I mean, he still went to Texas Tech. It's just like Baylor taking credit for Jalen Petrie and
I said that jokingly, and only so many people will get that, but it's because after the draft last year, I got a DM from somebody saying, thank you, Matt Rule, and so I'm just saying thank you, Matt Wells, because that's how Tyree Wilson eventually got there. But I know that Joey and them deserve some credit, just like I know Dave Arend and them deserve some credit, but just having a little fun and poking back, that's
for sure. And then TCU, of course, with Quentin Johnson going in the first round as well. So and Felix and DK Uzama from Kansas State. So yeah, you're right. There was success in the first round, but Baylor game compared to those, it's a big deal. And Baylor, when was Baylor's last first round pick?
It would have been Corey, I guess.
Corey was the last first round?
Just off the top of my head, I haven't done any research into it, but that's the one that comes to mind. I'm trying to think if there's anybody after that. I don't think so.
Yeah, so, it's been a while. And so you're just kind of playing catch-up.
And where'd he go? The Cleveland freaking Browns again.
I know. It's sad. Sad times. But hopefully this regime in Cleveland will be a little better.
I just don't know the attraction there is to each other, but to where again, I listed off 5 of the names that have been their biggest draft picks over the last 25 years, and they all have played in Cleveland or were drafted by Cleveland. It's bizarre, but anyways, there was the draft. Siaki Ika going late 3rd round to the Cleveland Browns. Hopefully he has a long and prolific career there and makes tons of money and has lots of accolades along the way. But for these other players that were also extended invites or undrafted free agent deals, best of luck to them as well. More than a handful will get an opportunity here in mini camps over the next couple of weeks. Or over the course of the remainder of the offseason, guys like Ika will have the build-up to their rookie season. So I hope that works out well for them, and we'll see on next year. But, yeah, there's a lot of names. It's just there's a lot of names that they need to prove something. Your Garmin Randolphs and your Gabe Halls and your – whoever you want to link in there without even thinking about the guys who could potentially go early. But those are kind of the next wave up as those types of names and players. And Clark Barrington now as well, and Jake Roberts and whoever else you want to throw in there. Let's see what they can do and what they can add. A big year would go a long way. Meanwhile, I guess a couple of recruiting notes, a new commitment. It seems like, eventually there's going to be a week where there's not somebody new added to the roster, right? Because it seems like it's been about 20 weeks in a row that there's somebody coming or going on this roster. And I'm not complaining. It's just it's every week that there's a new addition. It's you just think that at some point the faucet's going to turn off all the way and there's going to be just no movement for a while. But right before the portal closes, and maybe that's why it will now kind of cease as the portal has closed. But before it did, Trevin Maye, Oregon defensive lineman, announced that he is heading to Baylor. Obviously had at least some crossing of paths with Matthew Pallage last year in Eugene, Oregon. But we got to talk to him on the radio, and he seems like a good young man, and kind of explained some of the process and how he eventually wound up in Waco. But your thoughts on the latest pickup and what was probably the last pickup for the foreseeable, like for a little while because of the portal being closed, or is that how it's going to work, or just kind of explain it for the folks out there? But first, your thoughts on what this actually means for this football roster.
Right. So let's start with Maye first. And he visited for the Green and Gold game, took his official visit and all that, got to see campus. And I think he came with his girlfriend on his visit. And by all accounts, really enjoyed it. I think things had been trending in Baylor's direction for a while. A relationship with Matthew Pallage, but also a fit with Baylor's scheme and kind of what they're asking him to do up front. He's going to have to be versatile. They're going to play him some at nose tackle. They're going to play him some all across the defensive line, whether that's at end or nose tackle. I did think initially he would be Gabe Hall's primary backup, but I also think he'll be the nose tackle primary backup behind Jarrell Boykins, who obviously got injured in the spring game. So he might end up being a starter at the beginning of the season. We'll see. But again, versatile defense lineman. It's exactly what they needed. He's about 6'5", 295 pounds. Doesn't have a ton of production from Oregon, but a big part of it is because he made the transition from edge to the interior of the defensive line. So he was initially like 260 pounds, I think, a year ago, and now he's all the way up to 290. So they put on a lot of weight. Or he put on a lot of weight very quickly to kind of transition himself into a different role. And so I think Baylor's actually going to get the best version of him these next 2 years because he does have 2 more years of eligibility remaining. But his time at Oregon had 12 tackles, 2 for loss, and 1 sack in 2022. Had a better year in 2021 with 21 tackles, 4 for loss, and 1.5 sacks. So again, not crazy production, but the versatility, the natural fit, the upside, what he could be, was a huge reason why Baylor went out and added him. Now, as far as what's next in the portal, there's actually a big visitor coming this weekend from Utah State. We've mentioned him, the cornerback Ajani Carter. He's a guy who Baylor's been recruiting really hard since he entered the portal, but it's taken some time for him to get on his visit to Waco. He'll also visit Indiana this week as well. So something to keep an eye on. He's a guy who's got 1 year of eligibility, would come in, start at cornerback right away, and provide more depth. So again, we could hear something next week, Craig. We might have another commit to talk about, potentially, if he does end up choosing Baylor.
I mean, there has to come a point when there's not somebody, right? I mean, eventually their roster will settle in because this is, 10-plus exits, 10-plus entrances, and it's still going on. And I'm not complaining. It just literally feels like every single week for 15 weeks in a row, we walked in here and there's some new player to talk about or some guy who's leaving or just some change to the roster. Right. It's just kind of wild.
And yet some people still complain that Baylor doesn't use the transfer portal, which is
I don't know baffling. How you could say that this year. I mean, that's honestly just what are you looking at on your screen if you think they're not using it this year? I would love to understand how you even come to that conclusion given that there's been 10-plus guys going both directions.
It's getting greedy. That's all it is. It's getting greedy and thinking.
Is that?
Yeah, it's thinking the portal fixes all your
reality
problems.
Is not real. I mean, what?
Yeah,
I don't get it.
I'm with you, and I've had to answer tons of questions on why aren't they using the portal? Why are there only 3 spots? Why are there this? Why are there that? And just simply
there's only 3 spots because otherwise there'd be 13 because they'd have 10 spots that weren't filled by transfers they brought in. But apparently they're not doing anything. I'm sorry. That's a silly thing to gather from all of the activity that's all that's like the silliest thing you could gather. And they haven't been active.
The thing that people need to take away from this offseason is that the players at Baylor love Baylor. And that's simply the biggest reason why, there might not be as much attrition as some people want. The players at Baylor love Baylor. And as far as Baylor goes, it's a culture thing too. You want to have a good culture, so you want guys who love your program. You don't want to just take rentals at every position and then guys who don't truly love Baylor. You know what I mean? So you mix and match with transfers, you bring in guys who fit your program, your culture, while also building the guys in the room and building up the entire roster and guys who love Baylor and are going to work hard to make the team better. So yeah, Baylor's done a great job in the portal. Adding Maye was a great addition here. He fits what they need, and there might be one more addition as well. Like I mentioned, it looks like defensive back, cornerback is the area they're going to focus on for that one. And then I believe that'll close up their roster. I think they'll fill the remaining roster spots. You might see a walk-on get put on scholarship or something along those lines. But yeah, in general, I think that's all the work Baylor's really going to do in the portal. And I know that someone's going to have this question, but the portal closed on Sunday. That just means that guys who are at current schools, that's their deadline to enter the portal. Right? So you have to be in the portal by Sunday, and that's if you're a true transfer. Grad transfers have different rules, but a true transfer, you had to be in by Sunday, but that does not necessarily mean you have to be committed to a school by Sunday. Guys are going to make decisions through the summer, so just keep an eye on that. But most guys will want to make that decision by the time the football team reports, which is in early June. So just kind of keep an eye on this next month for other schools, because, again, I don't think Baylor's going to be heavily focused on the portal this month.
All right, so there you have the latest. Trevin Maye, welcome to the program, and we will look forward to covering him starting here in the next few months, I guess, because it is going to be quiet on that front until they get back to practicing, which obviously they just closed up, so that'll be, later on this summer. But I'm sure we'll talk and hear more about him along the way, and looks like it could be a pretty big addition along with the various others on paper. But yeah, it's been very active. I don't know how it's been anything other than that, given the amount of in and out we've seen with this roster, and it's still ongoing. And so we'll wait for that to settle down and then have to do like a 3-hour special documenting all of the changes that have taken place and going in depth on those. But in all seriousness, a lot going on with football, and good to see that, some dreams are being lived out now professionally. Hopefully those last for a long while, like I said a little while ago. Meanwhile, we're up against it. We got a lot of questions. I don't want to go well over here. So congrats to A&T on winning another national championship over the weekend. That was a big deal. As far as the rest of the spring sports go, we don't normally dive in here, and I try to cover some of this in the good, bad, ugly every week, so I don't have a whole lot to say here really, but you got tennis going to the postseason, both men's and women's. We got golf heading into the postseason, and some of them are in postseason, but like going from conference postseason to regular postseason, and just a lot of that ongoing right now. Softball, baseball, both limping out of the weekend, really. Softball's obviously going to be in the postseason. Baseball has no shot. It's being real about it. Softball losing a ranked or an unranked series for the first time all year to Iowa State. That wasn't so hot, but just you're gonna get some weekends that are great, some weekends that are a little rougher. But anything stand out to you from the rest of the sports that you feel like touching on before we get into the mailbag here? I
know softball's dealing with injuries, and so you're kind of seeing them. They're not unraveling, but they're just not keeping up pace with the top of the Big 12. And once again, the Big 12 in softball very loaded at the top. And so I still think the softball team has had a good year, and I still think they can finish relatively strong, but my expectations obviously have come down significantly on their postseason outlook, just kind of how far they can go. Baseball, I think we knew this year was going to be rough, but still not making the Big 12 tournament would be kind of, I know it's year one, but still that would not be a great start, I don't think, to the Mitch Thompson era. But again, there's still a chance. They're kind of trying to keep pace with Kansas to make the Big 12 tournament. Outside of that, Acro winning 8 straight national championships. That's phenomenal. They continue to dominate the sport. This year, it felt like it was even easier than in past years. It just felt like every week was a domination. So, yeah, that's pretty much the main things that I have on the spring sports. It has not been great.
All right, let's get into the mailbag here. Scotty B, how much of an adjustment do you think coaches and players will have to make with the new clock rules for college football when compared to the past?
Right. So, I mean, if people aren't familiar, a couple of the rules: no consecutive timeouts, clock runs after first downs except inside 2.5 minutes, no untimed down at the end of the first quarter and third quarter. So it's going to speed the game up a little bit. I actually think that kind of helps Baylor. Baylor likes to run the football, play at a certain pace. So, who knows? It could help them. Again, I think it's kind of a moot point. I think it's going to impact most teams the same kind of all around.
Yeah, I don't think it's anything super it doesn't create an overhaul of the way you've always been doing things. I think, like many have said and said beforehand, it's the commercials that waste more time than anything, right, more than the game itself. So I don't think the game will be, all that different, although I do look forward to being able to ask Dave Aranda about that probably in July at Media Days, get his thoughts on some of the rules changes. But I don't think there will be as much of an adjustment as maybe you think initially. Anyways, I'll say the ceiling for Baylor women's tennis is round of 32 due to the 2-seed A&M if Baylor beats SMU again. Now the men's ceiling should be Sweet 16, could be Sweet 16 if they beat 9-seed South Carolina, because South Carolina lost 5 of the last 9 matches, but it does require a rematch win against Florida State. We will see what happens to both.
Yeah, I think the women's team is not getting past Texas A&M. That's not going to happen. I just hope they beat SMU in the first round, to be honest. And then as far as the men go, I guess he mentioned South Carolina in the second round, who's the 9 seed. Baylor's been really tested this year, this men's tennis team. So they're really not going to see any teams until they get to the Sweet 16 as far as the level of competition. They've seen all these teams. I think they can make it to the Sweet 16. Then they would probably lose there because then you'd probably have to play Texas, who Baylor hasn't had a lot of success against this year. They're the 1 seed. So, I think Sweet 16 is probably the ceiling for them.
They're basically like softball. They're pretty good. Their record doesn't necessarily show how good they are because they've beaten they played a lot of good teams, and just so happens there's like elite teams in the conference like TCU and Texas, whereas in softball it's like Oklahoma and Oklahoma State, and then I guess Texas to a lesser extent. So or close extent. So it's kind of the way that I view it. They're okay. They're good. They could win a couple matches, but they're not going to go win a title if we're just being real about it. But a lot of it depends on matchups. So we'll see how those fall. Upset maybe clears the way and gets you a step further than you thought. We'll see. But they got to take care of their business and let the rest fall how it may. Big Cheese 83, assuming you believe Keytron and Monterey will be Baylor's 1 and 2 receivers statistically, who will be 3, and will it even be a wide receiver?
Yeah, I think statistically that's an interesting question. Last year it was Monterey, Gavin Holmes, Josh Cameron, Hal Presley before you got to a tight end. So I do think the third leading receiver will be a receiver. Man, that's a good question. I think Jordan Neighbors is going to probably have the most opportunities to have big games, but he might kind of do some of his damage running the football. So as far as just catching, it's either him or Armani. I'll go with Neighbors for now, though. I just think he's so explosive. I think his catches will be for big plays. He just might not have, the total amount of catches as a guy like Armani might.
I'll go Hal Presley as the number 3 guy, although I think, a Drake Dabney could potentially be that. Somebody's going to have to fill the role of Ben Sims, and I know that Jake Roberts could maybe be that guy too. I don't think it's impossible that it could be a tight end, but I'll go Hal Presley. He had a pretty good year. I think he's going to get in the end zone a little bit for them, so I'll roll with him. But I think there's like 3 or 4 guys, Josh Cameron, Jake Roberts, Drake Dabney,
it's
Hal
hard to
Presley.
Predict.
You could be any of those guys.
You really got to predict explosive plays to a certain extent, but you're right. Hal's going to get a lot of chances. He will for sure. He's in that group as well. He's probably ahead of Armani, actually. But him and Neighbors, I'm pretty excited for Jordan Neighbors this year. I think he could have a huge impact. But again, he's got to stay healthy just like Monterey does.
Yeah, that's a big key right there. So Big Cheese, any number of guys, but those are a little slightly less than a handful that seem to make a lot of sense, and like I said, I'll go with Hal there. Dak JD, good to have options, that's for sure. Dak JD90, is the transfer portal affected how many players we take out of high school, and if not yet, do you expect it to in the future?
It does impact that because Baylor can't, they got to take transfers, so you're kind of limiting how many spots you have with high school prospects. So, you could use those transfer portal spots on high school recruits, but Baylor's choosing not to because they want to supplement young talent with more veteran and experienced guys from the portal. I think that's how you have to do it. So, yeah, I mean, it is going to affect that, but honestly in a good way. I mean, if you look at Baylor's recruiting classes, I mean, more times than not, there's like 5 or 6 guys who really don't make much of an impact during their time at Baylor, and you would have rather used those spots on transfers. So it's just kind of the reality of the situation. Baylor has to take transfers, in my opinion, in order to compete. Now, how many? That's the bigger question, because right now they're taking 13 because the roster wasn't very good last year and they struggled to compete at times last year with the best teams, in the conference. But going forward, you'd like that number to be more like, 5 or 6, and then the rest of your roster is already really good.
Bears 224, or excuse me, Baylor Bear 88. Before the spring game, I bought a green number 2 jersey from the 2011 era at the surplus sale. I'm sure in my heart this was the very one worn by T-Dub when he caught the game when he passed from RG3. Prove me wrong. Note your answer really doesn't matter, as I'm telling everyone this is it, and I'm sticking to my story. Laugh out loud.
That's great.
Yeah, I mean, I'd stick to that as well till somebody can prove you wrong, I suppose. But I'm trying to think, were they wearing green jerseys that day? That'd be the first tell.
Right.
And I don't even recall off the top of my head. But I wasn't around back then. Do you remember?
I don't remember which jersey.
I think they were wearing green.
I think they were too, in the back of the end zone there. That's really cool. I mean,
that is cool. If that's the Terrence Williams jersey, especially. That's super
not,
cool.
Stick to the story. You're right.
Yeah, maybe it's actually from a few years later. It's like a Tayon Sales jersey, which is not nearly as cool. No disrespect to Tayon Sales. He's a fine Bear. But, yeah, no, I would stick with it was Terrence Williams as well. And, yes, that's the one that he caught the RG3 pass in. Let them prove you wrong. But sounds like you got a good little piece of memorabilia there. Baylor Bear 88, we do appreciate you. Bears 224, what does Dave Aranda not naming a starter last week say about the QB competition from your understanding? Happy he didn't and hope he doesn't until fall.
I mean, again, I think
it just never made any sense to me. I mean, I said this last week, to be just blunt about it. I was hoping that he wasn't going to. It just didn't make any sense to put that type of pressure on Blake or Sawyer. I mean, not that either one, like Sawyer wasn't transferring anywhere if he didn't get the job. It was really Blake that you're like, okay, does he quit football? Does he go play baseball? Does he transfer somewhere and play football? Does he go down a level? I mean, like, what does he do? But he's got options. People act like he didn't have options almost. And it's like, no, he has every option in the world other than I'm going to go start at Alabama. So none of those things are on the table if you don't name a starter, really. And so that's why it just made overwhelming sense to not name somebody unless you were absolutely positively convinced that it was like this guy, it has to be this guy. And there was just no indication that we saw, at least, that someone had separated themselves in such a way. Granted, we don't see everything behind the scenes, but even then, just from what you could tell, it didn't seem like even then there was like such a separation that it was like clearly this is Blake Shapen's team just already. So just going on what we had to see and what we had to hear, it just seemed a little bit puzzling to go forward and make a decision when you really weren't in a position to have to. And so I don't really feel one way or the other, but I guess if I have to feel a certain way, then I feel good that they haven't named a starter yet.
Yeah, I mean, and when we talked about this, I said the exact same thing. I didn't want them to name a starter going into the fall, right now, because I feel like everything that we've heard, so Blake Shapen was better throughout the spring, but everything we also heard was that Sawyer Robertson's best football is ahead of him, and that once he understands the scheme, there's a ceiling there that I don't think Blake Shapen really can get to compared to Sawyer. But the question was, how long does it take for Sawyer? So my thing is, why wouldn't you wait till the fall so that you can see how far Sawyer has advanced and how much, clarity he has on the offense? I just think this didn't make sense to me. But I will also say I don't think the fact that he hasn't named a quarterback the week after the spring game means that he won't. I mean, he very well could do it tomorrow. He could do it this week. Like, you never know. But I do think that the fact that there is a pause probably is telling that maybe they did have a conversation and maybe decided either A, it wasn't the time, B, they want to wait till the fall, or C, just let's do it this week in the future. I don't know.
Yeah, timing-wise, it just would be weird to, like, tomorrow on a random Wednesday in May, just be like, here's our starting quarterback. Yeah. It seemed like if you're going to do it, you do it when everybody was kind of in football mode, and I think everybody's kind of not exiting that, but, you know, now the draft's over with, and now it's, like, really the offseason where now the portal's closing up, and there's going to be less transfer activity. So, yeah, I just feel like you would strike while the iron's hot interest-wise, but who knows
and
what
the way
they're thinking.
He said it. The way he said it was like, we're going to do this basically, it felt like tomorrow is what it felt like, and that obviously did not happen, which, again, I think it's a good thing. I think we agree on that.
Yeah. WTT78, do you think last year Aranda wanted to be more aggressive in the secondary and Roberts disagreed with him, or do you think we just weren't good enough last year to play close to the line of scrimmage? Let's just answer this first.
Yeah, so I don't think they were good enough to do it at cornerback and safety. I don't think they were good enough to play press coverage. And I don't think this was an Aranda versus Roberts decision entirely. I will say that it did feel like there were times they probably should have, and they kept running that zone, and it just did not work. So maybe there was some disagreement, but I don't think that it was intensely disagreed upon, because Matthew Pallage coming in is really the main reason that they're moving completely back to press coverage, more aggressive style in the secondary, it seems.
Yeah, it seemed to me like they were trying to do everything to not have that whole portion of the defense cave in on itself. Right. And so they were trying to protect it, but it was like a house of cards that one thing goes wrong and it all comes crumbling down.
And they couldn't create any pressure.
Right.
So you added all that together, it just was a recipe for disaster.
Who starts in the secondary this year, and how do you think this aggressive style Pallage brings in the secondary will work out?
So, I mean, I guess going off the spring game, I think Chateau Reed and Tevin Williams were probably the best cornerbacks in the game, but I do think it will be a transfer, and then Tevin Williams, I think, is who I'm going to go with starting at cornerback. Chateau and Isaiah Dunson are kind of right there. As far as safety goes, I think Devin Lemire and A.J. McCarty will be starters, and then although AJ is still battling with Bryson Jackson, I think they're going to be kind of utilized in different packages. So I expect them to rotate, kind of be co-starters next year. But then Devin Lemire, and I'm going to go with Devin Bobby. I think those are your two starters at the safety positions for Baylor.
Let's see. Who's he already asked that. Okay, Bear for Cleats. I'm always interested in how the football recruiting classes perform as a whole. This year, the 21 class will head into year 3 in the program. Do you think this is a make or break year for this group? And just looking at it, you got Tevin Williams, Tate Williams, Jordan Jenkins, Jackie Marshall, Cameron Bonner, Elijah Bean. A lot of these guys are gone.
Monterey
Baldwin, Cooper Lands, Josh Cameron, and that's Tyrone Brown. That's pretty much the group there. There's like, you know, Hal Presley transferred in, but there's, you know, a handful of guys that are gone from that class as well. Is it make or break?
Yeah, I mean, it kind of is, right? Because we're going to see a lot of these guys kind of have their first opportunity to be starters. You know, Tevin Williams is going to play more football this year than he has in the past. Tate Williams as well. We haven't seen him really play much at all. He's probably going to be a starter at guard. The only guys that really have played a lot up to this point, Devin Lemire was a full-time starter last year. Monterey Baldwin, a full-time starter last year as well. So those two guys are kind of, I think, not necessarily know what you're getting, but we've gotten to see them at least play and perform at Baylor. But, yeah, I mean, Cooper Lands, what's he going to look like along the defensive line? It's getting close to him for, you know, what are we going to see from you type moment. Jackie Marshall moving to defensive line finally. So we'll see how he looks. I'll honestly say there's a lot of guys in this class that I'm still like, I don't think it's make or break time, but it is finally time where it's like, okay, you need to get on the field. I guess that's probably the bigger thing. I'm not.
Are you taking up a scholarship at this point, or are you contributing to the actual play on the field?
And on the offensive line in this class, if you take away Tate Williams, you know, Connor Heffernan, Ryan Lingyell, I don't think either of them are in the too deep at the moment. So something to look at there. Tyrone Brown, he was playing third string linebacker in the spring game. Jordan Jenkins is like the fifth string running back.
Haven't heard anything about him in a long time.
He was banged up and then played in the spring game, very limited. So yeah, I do think it's time for them to take a step, but I don't think that if Jackie Marshall isn't an all Big 12 player this year, then he's a bust. That's, you know, I Does that make sense? Like, he's
they don't need to go win Heisman trophies, but they need to be able to play and contribute and make some plays. Yeah. They need players to grow up and mature, and I don't mean grow up like they've been bad, but like the spotlight's on you now. Like, you've been here for a couple years. Like, time to go, time to perform, and time to go do your thing and, you know, excel. And hopefully that's what a lot of these guys do. But yeah, we're getting to that point now where it's like kind of, you know what, or get off the pot as far as. Okay, you got a couple years left now. It's time to go. Okie Bear fan, what football players do you predict having the best chance to make a huge jump between now and first game, utilizing the summer and fall to improve based off of their spring progression and areas that can greatly improve through self-driven practice and study?
Yeah, I mean, I think Keytron Jackson, based on what I heard this spring and what he accomplished, I think he's going to continue to be a big riser. And a lot of Baylor fans are sitting there being very negative about his spring game performance or lack thereof. So if you're going to put that as like his baseline, what you're expecting from him at Baylor this year, what we saw in the spring game, then I think you're going to be very impressed by what you see from him in the fall. You know, I think a guy like Carmelo Jones showed flashes in the spring game, had a really good spring. So I could see him getting better and better as a young guy and really taking that step forward for this team. You know, other guys, Trey Wilson, true freshman, played really well in the spring game. Jackie Marshall didn't play in the spring game, but I think he's going to be a huge factor on the defensive line as well. So I guess those are a few of the names that I'm definitely keeping an eye on.
Yeah, I mean, those are definitely some names. I think there's a lot of guys that can definitely improve on their own, but that's a team and a position group thing as well, as getting out there without the coach's guidance, although a little wink, wink, nudge, nudge, like, hey, you know, I'm sure there's a little bit of direction given unofficially, but hopefully you have the right leaders in place. I mean, that's the big thing. Who are the leaders and who will, you know, like you said, be self-driven to go and improve. And I don't think there were maybe a ton of those guys last year just based on kind of the results we saw. So hopefully that's a little bit different here. And it's hard to really gather that too from our standpoint, but maybe that's something that, you know, starts to get kind of talked about over these next few weeks, and we get word of and can say, like, hey, you know, Tevin Williams is leading the corners and blah, 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 blah. But, yeah, it remains to be seen. I'm sure there's a lot of guys, though, that will improve on their own. Thank you. Panther City Bear, what is Baylor's biggest weakness after the spring game on each side of the ball?
Yeah, I mean, I know people are going to point to the spring game and then just say that this is a position that they're fine at, but I still think it's secondary cornerback. I mean, there's a reason they're still looking at cornerback transfers, and it's not because they were dominant all spring. I mean, they had a good spring game. There's still areas to improve. I do have concerns at linebacker as well. So I'd say cornerback, linebacker are my two biggest concerns right now on the defensive side. Offensively, you know, I'm going to be honest here. I mean, it's quarterback. I mean, if they get great play from the quarterback position, then they're going to be really, really good. They'll be a 10-plus win team this year if they get great play at the quarterback spot. So I don't know that I could go with any other position outside of that because they need that position to play really well.
You really think they can win 10 games the way they're set up right now?
I'm saying it if they get great quarterback play, which meaning, I mean, honestly, if you have a top 3 quarterback in the Big 12, it's really hard not to find yourself in the Big 12 championship game. At least it has been in the past.
Yeah, I know. It's just like, even if they score a lot of points, it's like, who are they stopping, though? I mean, you just said yourself, like, the concern's the back 7, you know, and the D-line's not even that squared away compared to, you know, what we kind of thought last year. We know how that went. So there's a lot of questions. I mean, you know, it's a year where you expect them to rebound and have a better year, but they will need Blake Shapen to play well. That is for sure an area that you look at, and I think that, yeah, on offense, that probably is your biggest weakness. Defensively, I think you can look all over the place, but I still, wonder about that secondary just as a whole, and I guess the corners in particular is like, can they hold up? Because, like, you talk about going man-to-man. It's like, that doesn't make me feel better. It makes me feel worse about what they might do next year, because you're saying basically, like, hey, we're not going to bail you out all year long, which I kind of love because, hey, if you're going to give up points, give up points. Don't, like, try to fool us and, you know, and all that, but yeah, I mean, let these guys get exposed and at least let everybody else play free, because it was so disjointed last year. The way they were masking other things.
Too
and
much
just
thinking. Yeah, way too much thinking.
Yeah, I'd say quarterback and just overall play there, and then secondary cornerback would still be my main focus as well. But yeah, you could look at linebacker and have an issue there. You can look at the D-line and still have some questions there as well, even with Trevin Maye and Byron Vaughn's being adds here. Recently, we know that the secondary might get addressed again with, potentially a portal addition here in the future. So we'll see when the dust settles, when fall rolls around, of what the roster actually looks like. But on paper, those are kind of consistently the main issues, it appears, and will remain that way for the time being. So thank you, Panther City Bear, for those questions. I guess he also added on, Aranda previously said he would name a starting quarterback after spring game. He obviously hasn't said anything. What is your take on his silence? I get the sense that Shapen is the favorite, and we already talked about that. And, yeah, I would say that I think he's the favorite as well.
I think he's the favorite if they announce it right now. I do think that if they wait, then, it kind of signifies that Shapen hasn't done enough to, get the job yet. So it could open the door up a little bit. But at this current moment, yeah, I would be like, if they announced it today and it was anyone other than Blake Shapen, I would be pretty shocked.
Yeah, I think too, and we got to go here. But the risk you run as well is if you don't need to name Sawyer if it's Sawyer right now. But even going into next year, if it's him at the beginning of the year, what happens if he doesn't work out? And then you are like, hey, Blake, and then Blake's there, and then it turns into a whole nother situation. Like, eventually he's got to go play in the fire, like everybody does, right? But that's why I think you would start off with Blake, and then if he doesn't perform well enough, then you make the logical move. If he does, then awesome, and Sawyer can wait like he shouldn't be able to wait. But, yeah, if you start off with Sawyer and then he flails, and then it's like, well, here's Blake, and then you're like, this is the only – you know what I'm saying? So – that'll be interesting to see how they handle all of that. But, yeah, as of right now, no announcement. If they did make one, I do think it would be Blake Shapen. We all do, and we will see how that goes. But, again, no real rush or need to do that at the moment. So, a lot of questions this week. Thank you to Scotty and Cheese and Dak and 88 and 224 and WTT78 and Bear for Cleats and Okie Bear and Panther City Bear. We appreciate all of you for posting your questions in the mailbag this week, and that'll about do it for us. Before we go, Grayson, anything you'd like to pass along here?
No, nothing this week. Just continue to stay locked in on the premium side of things. All kinds of really good content there. And, of course, 365 Sports Radio, Monday through Friday, 3 to 6 with Craig, Smokey, and Paul. Be sure to check that out at 3 today.
Yes, we'd love that if you would tune in with us and check us out if you haven't already. And if you have before, we do appreciate that. And if you do, we just ask that you hit like and subscribe. That's all we ask, and we do appreciate that as well, whether on this channel, on 365 Sports, whatever offerings we do give you. If you could hit like and subscribe, we would definitely have many thanks for you. So appreciate you listening, and thanks to Garrett Ross, and thanks to Jack McKenzie behind the scenes as well, and thanks to Grayson Grundhoefer. Thanks to you. We will talk to you next week. This has been the Bearcast on SicEm365.com.